choose the path of dialogue and diplomacy. This is the right path, and the time to take it is now, before any more lives are ruined or lost. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Norway.
President, let me thank the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugee, Filippo Grandi, for their frank accounts of the consequences of the Russian invasion for the civilians in Ukraine. We need your strong leadership in the response to this unfolding humanitarian crisis. Norway is stepping up our support to the civilian population in Ukraine. The government has announced it will provide up to $226 million to the humanitarian response. Let me start by underlining that Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for this humanitarian crisis. Through its unprovoked, unjustified, and irresponsible military aggression, it has blatantly violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The parties to the conflict in Ukraine must comply with their obligation under international law, including human rights and international humanitarian law. They must ensure the protection of the civilian population in all of Ukraine. We demand that all parties ensure the respect for and protection for all medical personnel exclusively engaged in medical duties, their means of transport and equipment, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities. We are calling on parties to the conflict to protect all humanitarian personnel and ensure and facilitate safe, rapid and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid for those in need. The space for neutral, impartial and independent humanitarian action must be restored and protected. Fighting is going on in and around urban areas with the use of heavy explosive weapons. We are deeply concerned about the long-term harm to the civilians, including children and civilian infrastructure. Homes, schools, hospitals, water plants and other civilian infrastructure is being damaged and destroyed. We are deeply concerned about the reported use of cluster munitions. Explosive remnants of war will continue to kill and injure even after the conflict ends, and they will prevent people from returning home, going to school, coming back to work, and rebuilding their communities. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are fleeing the conflict. We commend the neighboring countries for keeping their borders open and for the great generosity and solidarity shown with people fleeing the conflict. The door to safety and protection must remain open to all those in need without discrimination. We will do our part, including providing support. This weekend, 2 media workers were shot and injured. Journalists and media workers are civilians under international humanitarian law. The world relies on independent and truthful reporting of the events that are unfolding. The heroic effort of Ukrainian and international press are incredibly important. We urge all parties to respect and protect the press, both on the ground and online. We demand the unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine to restore the respect of the Charter of the United Nations and international law and prevent further civilian suffering. Russia started the war in Ukraine. It can choose to stop it now. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, USG Griffiths and UNHCR Grandi, for those startling updates on the catastrophic situation unfolding in Ukraine. Dear colleagues, with its unprovoked aggression, Russia is causing an unprecedented humanitarian situation in Ukraine on a scale that Europe has not seen in decades. We all know the toll of war. In every conflict, it is civilian populations that bear the worst of the consequences, that pay the high price. Conflicts equal with innocent victims, destruction, displacement and refugees, severe human suffering. Those who initiate conflicts do know this. We heard that the situation is alarming. UNHCR Grandi mentioned staggering numbers of hundreds of thousands of people on the move in and out of Ukraine, and all this in a matter of days. Women, children, elderly, and people with disabilities are currently the most in need. As this aggression goes on, civilians everywhere in Ukraine are terrified of what awaits them, when the rocket is going to fall on their roof, or what other ways this absurd war will affect them. International law is clear. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure constitutes serious crimes, and perpetrators must be held accountable. There is no justification for this war, as there is no justification when bridges are destroyed, when infrastructure is deliberately targeted, when missiles hit residential areas. Dear colleagues, we're happy to hear that despite hostilities, the UN operation in Ukraine has expanded. We support a strong and reinforced presence of the United Nations and humanitarian partners on the ground. We support the safe, unimpeded access and protection of humanitarian workers and the deliveries to the areas affected by conflict. Our messages are clear. Civilian and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Security and access for humanitarian efforts must be guaranteed. Safe and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and its people is and should remain a priority. International humanitarian and human rights law must be upheld, in particular the four Geneva Conventions and their first additional protocol. Human rights violations and other crimes must be documented for the purpose of accountability. We commend all countries that are hosting refugees. As already announced last week by Prime Minister Rama, we are happy to shelter Ukrainians forced to flee because of the war. Albania has joined the wide array of sanctions recently adopted by the European Union. The airspace of Albania has been closed to all Russian operators except for flights conducted for emergency and humanitarian needs. We are working to provide assistance in military and hospital supplies to Ukraine. Dear colleagues, the decisions and actions of the coming days will directly affect the lives of millions of people. What is happening in Ukraine should not happen anywhere. We need peace, not war. We need friendship, not aggression. We are and will stand with Ukraine. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Сейчас я предоставляю
I now
слово
give the floor
представителю
to
Индии.
the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and UN High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their briefing. India remains deeply concerned at the unfolding developments in Ukraine, where the situation continues to deteriorate. Our considered call for immediate cessation of violence and an end to all hostilities is an urgent imperative. India's Prime Minister has advocated this strongly in his recent conversations with the leadership of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We welcome the commencement of direct talks. We reiterate our conviction that differences can only be bridged through sustained dialogue and diplomacy. We also underline that all members have agreed on the principles, the UN Charter, international law, and on the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. There is an urgent and pressing humanitarian situation developing in Ukraine. In such times of conflict, India attaches the highest priority to the safety and well-being of civilians, in particular women, children, and the elderly. We are of the view that core principles of humanitarian assistance should be fully honored. Taking into account the humanitarian requirements in Ukraine, my government has also decided to provide urgent relief supplies, including medicines, and these are being dispatched tomorrow. We remain deeply concerned for the safety and security of thousands of Indian citizens, including students, stranded in Ukraine. Our evacuation efforts have been adversely impacted by the developments on the ground at the border crossings. Given that the safety of Indian nationals is of paramount importance to my government, senior ministers from the Government of India are being deployed as special envoys to Ukraine's neighboring countries. We thank them for their cooperation at this difficult time. We stand ready to help those from our neighbors and developing countries who are also stranded in Ukraine and may seek assistance. We also support all UN humanitarian efforts. As reiterated yesterday, there is no other option but to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue as the only way ahead. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I start by thanking our briefers, Filippo Grandi and Martin Griffiths. As a result of President Putin's decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a country of 44 million people is now on the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Whatever my Russian colleague claims, the world can see that Russia's indiscriminate attacks against men, women and children across Ukraine and its disregard for international humanitarian law. Missiles have rained down on Kharkiv, with cluster munitions hitting residential areas and injuring residents. Disruption to supply chains has caused food shortages in Kramatorsk. The reckless bombing of an oil depot in Vasilkiv has unleashed toxic fumes in nearby communities. Violence in Kyiv has forced people to seek refuge underground, with many thousands, including the elderly and disabled, unable to evacuate. And as we've heard from the UN, today hundreds of civilians have been killed as a result of the Russian invasion. My Russian colleague may try to paint the UN's reporting as hysteria, just as they said it was Western hysteria to warn of their impending invasion. But let's look at the facts. 500,000 people have already fled to Poland, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, Slovakia, and other countries. 7 million people have been displaced, and that figure, as the High Commissioner told us, is rising exponentially. UN agencies and humanitarian partners have been forced to suspend operations. In this moment, as the High Commissioner said, of urgent need, the situation that the agencies face is impossible. The UK stands with the Ukrainian people during their time of need. Yesterday, Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, announced $54 million in aid to help our Ukrainian friends. This latest assistance package brings the total amount of UK government aid pledged to Ukraine this year to $190 million. Last week, Prime Minister Johnson also announced the UK would guarantee up to $500 million of loans to Ukraine through the multilateral development banks. The UK will also participate in tomorrow's UN appeal. UK government experts have also deployed to the region to provide humanitarian support to those fleeing violence in Ukraine. But colleagues, we know that a humanitarian response is not enough to save the Ukrainian people from the disaster that Russia is inflicting on them. So our message today is simple. Once again, for the sake of humanity, we call on President Putin to stop this war and withdraw his forces from Ukraine. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank
Сейчас я
you.
предоставляю
And I
слово
give the floor
представителю
to
Ганы.
the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me thank USG Martin Griffiths and High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their very sobering briefings, which unfortunately confirm the images we are seeing on the media. Ghana expresses serious concerns about the unfolding humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The briefings highlight the indiscriminate attacks in civilian populated areas, which have spread fear and panic among the population, who have also been forced into shelters and subways. Children and newborn babies have not been spared of this regrettable situation. Thousands of people have also been internally displaced, including Ghanaians and other nationals, with more than 500,000 people forced to flee to neighboring countries as refugees. Ghana calls for the immediate and unconditional cessation of the hostilities which have resulted in the current humanitarian crisis, and urges the parties to refrain from further attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. We strongly call on the parties to grant unfettered access to humanitarian agencies and to guarantee their protection and safety. We also call for the safe passage of all civilians caught up in the war and who desire to leave Ukraine. In this regard, Ghana encourages neighboring countries of Ukraine to facilitate the free passage of persons fleeing the war without discrimination and provide them with humanitarian assistance, including medical care, in line with the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. We continue to urge the parties to accept the path of peace and seek an early resolution through dialogue and diplomacy. I thank you, Mr. President.
Спасибо. Сейчас я
Thank you. And I
предоставляю слово
give the floor to the
представителю Габона.
representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le secrétaire général adjoint Martin
Under
Griffiths
Secretary
et
General
le
Martin
haut-commissaire
Griffiths
Filippo
and the
Grandi
High
pour
Commissioner
leurs
Filippo Grandi. I
exposés
thank them
édifiants.
for their very
Je me félicite
informative briefings.
de la participation
I
à ce débat
welcome the
du
participation
représentant
now
permanent
discussions
de
of
l'Ukraine.
the permanent representative of Ukraine.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
notre message
our
sur la situation qui
message
prévaut
on
en
the
Ukraine est clair.
situation in Ukraine is
Nous
clear.
ne voulons pas
We do
de
not
guerre contre un
want
État membre des Nations
a
Unies.
war against a United Nations member
Notre
state.
message contre les
Our
conséquences
message
humanitaires de
against
la
the
guerre
humanitarian
est tout
consequences
aussi
of
clair.
war is equally clear.
Mon pays
My
est
country
très préoccupé
is very
par les
concerned
attaques
by
contre
the
les civils
attacks against
et les biens
civilians
publics civils.
and civilian
Nous appelons
infrastructure.
les belligérants
We call on
à
the
s'abstenir de
belligerents to
toute utilisation
refrain
d'armes
from
dont
any
les
and
effets
all use
seraient
of the
indiscriminés.
weapons whose impact would be
Nous sommes
indiscriminate.
solidaires
We
des
stand
populations
shoulder
qui
to
se trouvent
shoulder
victimes d'une
with the
guerre qu'elles n'ont
population
pas
who
choisie,
are victims
une
of the
guerre
war they didn't
qu'elles n'ont
choose,
pas provoquée.
the war they did not
Nous
provoke.
demandons en conséquence
And we ask
que
therefore
l'aide humanitaire
that humanitarian
soit fournie
assistance
aux populations
be
qui
supplied
en ont besoin
to the
sans
population
entrave
in
ni
need,
discrimination.
without discrimination or hindrance.
Nous saluons en cela
We, therefore,
l'élan de générosité
commend
des pays
the
voisins de l'Ukraine
generosity shown by
dans
the
l'accueil
neighboring
des
countries
personnes
to
fuyant la
Ukraine
guerre.
who are hosting the people
Monsieur
who
le
are fleeing the
Président,
war. Mr. President,
je tiens à donner
I
écho
would like to
aux cris d'alarme des ressortissants et étudiants africains,
note
y
of
compris les
alarm
étudiants
as
de
regards
mon
the
pays,
African students,
qui,
including some
fuyant
from
la
my
guerre
country,
en
who
Ukraine,
are fleeing the
se
war
heurtent
in
à des
Ukraine
discriminations
and are
dans leur
encountering this
exode
process
et leur quête
a
d'abri.
discrimination as
De
they're
nombreux
seeking
témoignages
to
parlent
flee
d'actes de
and
racisme.
for refuge. We've received
Cela est inacceptable.
several reports of racism.
Nous demandons
This is
le respect de la
unacceptable.
dignité
We ask for the respect
et
of the
appelons à un
dignity
traitement équitable de
and for
toutes les personnes en
equitable
détresse.
treatment of all people
C'est le
in
lieu
dire
pour mon pays
circumstances.
d'amplifier
It
l'appel
is
de l'Union
the
africaine
opportunity for my
au
country
respect
to
du droit
recall the
international
African Union
qui
appeal for
s'applique
the
en pareilles
respect of
circonstances
international law,
et qui
who
prescrit un égal traitement
requires
pour toute personne
equal
franchissant les
treatment
frontières
for all
internationales
people who
dans un
cross
conflit.
international borders
Monsieur le
in
Président,
conflict areas. Mr.
la
President,
saignée humanitaire
the
et la détresse des
humanitarian
populations
disaster and
ne
the
peuvent
distress
s'arrêter
of the people
que si les
can
hostilités
only stop
s'arrêtent.
if the hostilities
C'est
stop.
pourquoi
And that is
nous
why
réitérons notre
we
appel
reiterate
à un
our
cessez-le-feu
appeal
immédiat
for an
et
immediate
à la
ceasefire
désescalade.
and de-escalation.
Il faut une réponse humanitaire à la mesure de l'ampleur des besoins en Ukraine et dans les pays voisins. L'appel que le secrétaire général lancera demain pour le financement du plan d'assistance humanitaire est à cet égard d'une grande opportunité. Pour terminer, mon pays exhorte la communauté internationale à faire preuve d'empathie et à soutenir toutes les personnes victimes de la guerre sans discrimination de nationalité ni de race. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
سيد الرئيس أشكر كل من السيد مارتن غريفيث والسيد فيليبو غراندي على مداخلتهما. سيد الرئيس لقد تدهور الأوضاع الإنسانية في أوكرانيا بشكل كبير في الأيام الأخيرة حيث يؤدي استمرار القتال إلى أضرار بالبنية التحتية وإصابات وقتلى في صفوف المدنيين. فحسب تقارير الأمم المتحدة يعاني مئات الآلاف من السكان من نقص شديد في الخدمات الأساسية. كذلك فقد تضررت ودمرت العديد من المنازل وأصبح مئات الآلاف من السكان نازحين أو لاجئين في الدول المجاورة. ومن هذا المنطلق يجب أن يتمكن جميع المدنيين الذين يحاولون الوصول إلى مكان آمن من القيام بذلك دون عوائق، وينبغي أن لا يتعرضوا للتمييز. وجراء الأزمة الأوكرانية نؤكد ضرورة التركيز على الأوضاع الإنسانية المتفاقمة للمدنيين، بما في ذلك عبر العمل على ضمان توفير الحماية لهم والحيلولة دون أن يصل الوضع الإنساني الكارثي لحالة يصعب معالجتها واحتوائها. ومن جانبها تنظر دولة الإمارات في الاحتياجات الإنسانية الأوكرانية الناجمة عن الأزمة من منطلق حرصها الدائم على تخفيف معاناة المدنيين تحت وطأة الصراع. إننا نشجب العنف القائم في أوكرانيا ونكرر على ضرورة ضبط النفس ووقف إطلاق النار والعمل على حل النزاع بالطرق السلمية. فاستمرار القتال سيؤدي إلى وقوع المزيد من الضحايا الأبرياء وسوء الأوضاع الإنسانية والتي يزيد من حدتها موسم الشتاء وموجات البرد القاسية في الوقت الذي يبحث فيها المدنيين عن ملاجئ ومناطق آمنة في ظل الأزمة الحالية. كذلك نحث جميع الأطراف على تنفيذ التزاماتها بموجب القانون الدولي بما في ذلك عبر السماح للمساعدات الإنسانية بالوصول للمحتاجين وعدم استهداف المدنيين. ونشدد مجددا على ضرورة الالتزام بمبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة لا سيما من حيث احترام سيادة واستقلال الدول ووحدة أراضيها وسلامتها الإقليمية. إن هذه المبادئ التي تأسست عليها الأمم المتحدة تنطبق على جميع الدول الأعضاء باختلاف قدراتها وإمكانياتها وحجمها الجغرافي. وختاما تجدد بلادي تأكيدها على أهمية العمل على التوصل لوقف إطلاق نار فوري والسعي لإيجاد حلول سلمية لما يخدم الأمن والاستقرار الإقليميين والدوليين. وشكرا.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the briefers for their informative presentations. Let me also take this opportunity to express our solidarity to all families who have lost someone in this war, to all people left without home, water, and electricity, to those who are fleeing in fear sometimes with nowhere to go, and to everyone who is now trapped in a conflict zone, desperately attempting to find refuge. I wish to commend all personnel that are now in Ukraine trying to alleviate the suffering of the population. We know that you are doing your best in very challenging circumstances, and we know that more could be done to assist you in your efforts. As we speak, hundreds of thousands of civilians have already fled Ukraine. Many more will certainly follow, millions perhaps. Most hostilities are being conducted in densely populated areas where the risks of civilian casualties increase, including children, particularly with the use of explosive weapons. Civilians are being called to join the fighting, possibly with no proper training. There are pressing humanitarian needs for medical services, medicines, health equipment, shelter, and protection. Brazil calls all parties to fully respect international humanitarian law and uphold at all times the principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, necessity, and humanity. It is of paramount importance to ensure the protection of civilians and of critical civilian infrastructure, as well as to ensure unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need and the protection of refugees and displaced persons. We also reiterate our appeal to Ukraine and Russia to facilitate the withdrawal of all persons who want to leave the Ukrainian territory. Brazil expresses its gratitude to Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, and others who are facilitating the exit of people fleeing the conflict, including Brazilians and Latin Americans. Mr. President, for international humanitarian law, it does not matter how a war came to existence or who was responsible for it. What matters is to spare civilians and maintain a minimum of humanity in an already inhumane situation. So, beyond any discussion in the Council on the reasons for this war, we can and we must come together to adopt measures to minimize the humanitarian impact of the conflict. This is the minimum that we can do. In moving forward, it's important to closely monitor the situation on the ground, the number of civilian casualties, and the immediate needs of the population. At the same time, there is no doubt that the best way to protect civilians and avoid a humanitarian crisis is to prevent conflict and, when it erupts, to immediately cease it. Any war will generate devastation, death, chaos, and fear. The greater the escalation, the higher the risks of human suffering. In the past few days, permanent members of the Security Council, the ones that bear the greatest responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, have been openly referring to severe unilateral sanctions, military actions, and nuclear forces. This must stop. The world needs these escalations to stop and dialogue to resume. The severe economic sanctions being imposed might have rippling effects in the world's economy, with consequences felt way beyond Russia. Possibly, the population in developing countries will be the ones that will suffer the most. The supply of arms and increasing militarization of the region will hardly promote dialogue. It will probably provoke more tensions. As we have seen reports on nuclear forces being put on high alert, I would like to recall what the International Court of Justice has once said about nuclear weapons. They have the potential to destroy all civilization and the entire ecosystem of the planet, and their threat or use would generally be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict. Any use of nuclear weapons would have unacceptable humanitarian consequences for present and future generations in the territory of Ukraine and beyond. So far, we have received reports of around 200 or 300 of civilian casualties in Ukraine, which is already devastating. If a party resorts to a weapon of mass destruction, what will be the number of deaths? What will be the extent of destruction? We have seen that before, and we hope, we plead to everyone involved that we do not see that again. I thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the representative.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to thank USG Griffiths and High Commissioner Grandi for their briefings. What is now unfolding in Ukraine is indeed heart-wrenching. We call upon all parties to exercise restraint, de-escalate the situation, and avoid civilian casualties. The safety and security of life and property of all civilians, including foreign nationals, and their humanitarian needs should be effectively ensured. It is of the utmost importance to prevent a large-scale humanitarian crisis. We welcome the remarks by the Secretary-General where he indicated that the United Nations will play an active role in coordinating the humanitarian assistance. In our view, the United Nations and the international community should provide humanitarian assistance in accordance with the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality as set forth in GA Resolution 46/182 in order to avoid politicization of humanitarian activities. Mr. President, what remains most important for the time being is to return to the track of diplomatic negotiations and a political settlement as soon as possible, and to promote a de-escalation of the situation. China supports the holding of direct dialogue between Russia and Ukraine, which is the ultimate way out of this crisis. The international community should provide favorable external conditions for dialogue and a political settlement, and avoid exacerbating the situation. Any action by this Council should place it in a better position to play a constructive role rather than leading to further escalation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Russian Federation. We listened very carefully to the briefings by Martin Griffiths and Filippo Grandi. The situation in Ukraine is, of course, the kind of situation that gives rise to most serious concern amongst all of us. We can see that the ordinary people are suffering. The people who basically ended up being hostages held by the Ukrainian radicals and nationalists who are clinging to power at any price. Now, why am I saying this? Because in those territories which came under the Russian armed forces control, the people are not encountering acute humanitarian issues. The local authorities, after the radicals have left, are working normally and providing all the necessary services to the people. The life-providing services to the people are functioning. The acute issues are only remain in those towns where the Ukrainian authorities issued a criminal responsible order to distribute arms to anyone who wants it, including criminals, the criminals who were let out of prisons for that specific purpose. And this resulted in mass instances of robberies and killings and looting. There's plenty of information about that in social networks. The social networks also have appeals from a number of heads of administrations calling on the Ukrainian authorities to stop this madness. We also note that there are many instances where later on the victims of the looters and gangsters are shamelessly presented as having perished at the hands of the so-called Russian infiltrators. We address the people in Kiev held by the radicals in the city as a human shield. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirms that all those peaceful citizens of Kiev can leave the capital of Ukraine without hindrance via the road Kiev-Vasilkov. This road is open and safe. Let me repeat it once again that the special military operation conducted by the Russian armed forces does not have the goal of occupying Ukraine or harming the local population. Demilitarizing the country, which is crammed with NATO weaponry, is aimed at protecting the long-suffering people in Donbass and Ukraine. The special operation conducted by Russia does not impact critical civilian infrastructure. Over the 5 days of the operation, there hasn't been a single documented case of targeted destruction or no evidence of the death of civilians caused by the Russian military. And we're constantly being told the opposite, referring to some kind of credible reports. Despite the fact that currently in the information area there is a huge number of fakes, the kinds of fakes that people are trying to place on us, the blame for what is being done by Ukraine itself. And this tide of dirty lies replicated in Western mass media, unfortunately, very unfortunately, have become a dangerous mark of our times. Today, at this meeting of Security Council, once again we heard about the bombings of residential areas, hospitals, schools and kindergartens. It is reliably known that the Ukrainian radicals are placing their attack weaponry in residential areas, which is a direct violation of international humanitarian law. We would ask Martin Griffiths and Filippo Grandi to please comment. Everyone knows very well that starting in 2014, Russia and Russia alone basically extended assistance to the peaceful people in Donbass who were encountering relentless shelling by the Ukrainian army and the blockade by Kiev. We already had several meetings of the Security Council where we explained this approach of ours, and I'm not going to repeat this. I will simply say that we deeply regret the fact that even today, when we're discussing the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, not a single Western colleague mentioned the citizens of Donbass, whose suffering for 8 years you've tried not to notice. A very important measure of supporting the people of Donbass was a decree issued by the President of Russia, Mr. Putin, in 2019, entitled On Defining for Humanitarian Purposes the Categories of People having the right to apply for Russian Federation citizenship under a simplified procedure. At the time when the people in southeast of Ukraine were basically pushed to the brink of survival by the criminal authorities in Kiev, who organized a socio-economic blockade of Donbass. In this situation, providing them the Russian citizenship allowed them to receive social allowances, pensions, salary, as well as education and healthcare services. Currently, in Russia, we have more than 110,000 refugees from Donbass. They had to leave their homes after an event a week ago when Kiev tried to yet once again resolve the Donbass issue militarily in violation of the Minsk package of measures. And the blame for this situation also belongs with our Western partners, who openly indulged Kiev in Kiev's rejection of Minsk and pumped the country full of weapons. Overall, according to the information we have, since the beginning of conflict in 2014, about 3 million Ukrainian citizens left for Russia. In conclusion, I would like to underscore yet once again that Russia did not start the war, that Russia is trying to end it. Ukraine started the war in 2014, except that all these years you tried not to notice it. It was very odd for us to hear from the representative of France that the European sanctions on Russia do not violate international humanitarian law. or the interests of the ordinary people in Russia. These duplicitous statements are something that we heard before in the context of other countries' situations. As regards the draft proposed by France and Mexico on humanitarian situation in Ukraine, we need to study the text very carefully before issuing any assessment thereof. In any event, please know that the Russian military will provide any needed humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainians in the territories that have been freed from the radicals. I now resume my function as President of the Council and give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, Mr. Under-Secretary General, High Commissioner. First of all, I would like to thank the Security Council for addressing this urgent issue. Every new day of the Russian unprovoked war against Ukraine increases the human sufferings across the entire country. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to the Secretary General for his powerful statement and relentless engagement with the situation in my country. The Ukrainian government welcomes the appointment of Mr. Amin Avod as Assistant Secretary General to serve as UN Crisis Coordinator for Ukraine, as I know he has arrived to Geneva and resumed his duties. His mission will be extremely difficult against the backdrop of the ongoing Russian military activities that are often equaled to war crimes. At the same time, millions of Ukrainians will require his attention, in particular our children, women, elderly, and other vulnerable citizens. So I wish him and his team strength and mercy in their work. Distinguished members, let us be clear, this is not only a security crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis. This war of choice is not only a violation of international code, it violates the conscience of the world. Security assistance is needed, but it alone is not enough. We call on the international organizations to provide us with humanitarian assistance. We call on you to register all cases in which international law and international humanitarian law are violated. Almost all speakers and briefers today were unanimous in their assessments. The situation in Ukraine could deteriorate sharply. Let me provide you with the latest available information from the government of Ukraine. Today is the fifth day of a full-scale, unprovoked and unjustified war launched by Russia against Ukraine. Launched by Russia against the very heart of Europe. Launched by Russia against the idea and ideals of democracy. It is the most horrible and large-scale invasion since World War II. In the morning, I told the General Assembly about the shellings of the residential city of Kharkiv by Russian Grads, killing and wounding dozens of innocent civilians. Now the residents of Kiev, the home of 3 million innocent people, and its suburbs are sitting within Russian crosshairs right now. According to Ukrainian Health Minister Viktor Lyashko, as of today, over 352 people, including 16 children, were killed, and about 2,040 people, including 45 children, wounded. Russia keeps attacking kindergartens and orphanages. Russia is attacking hospitals. Russia is attacking mobile medical aid brigades with shellfire and sabotage groups. Russia fired an ambulance crews near Zaporizhzhia and Kiev. Let me say that again so that you can see this image in your mind. Russia is attacking hospitals, mobile aid brigades, and ambulances. This is not the action of a state with a legitimate security concern. This is the action of a state determined to kill civilians. There is no debate. These are war crimes. These attacks violate the Rome Statute, and these attacks are far from over. That is why I say this is a humanitarian crisis. As we sit here, Russian missiles are aimed at destroying critical infrastructure, which could lead to a serious environmental disaster and even radioactive contamination. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. None of these facilities are legitimate military targets. The civilian population of Ukraine is the first to suffer from such attacks, and if we do not act today, it will be far from the last. We welcome the statement issued today by the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan on the situation in Ukraine. The statement about his decision to proceed with opening an investigation. In his statement, the ICC prosecutor says that he reviewed the office's conclusions arising from the preliminary examination of the situation in Ukraine and has confirmed that there is a reasonable basis to proceed with opening an investigation. In particular, he is satisfied that there is a reasonable basis to believe that both alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed in Ukraine in relation to the events already assessed during the preliminary examination by the office. Given the expansion of the conflict in recent days, it is his intention that this investigation will also encompass any new alleged crimes falling within the jurisdiction of his office that are committed by any party to the conflict on any part of the territory of Ukraine. The prosecutor will also be asking for the support of all state parties and the international community as a whole, as his office sets about its investigation. He will be calling for additional budgetary support for voluntary contributions to support all his situations and for the loan of gratis personnel. The importance and urgency of the prosecutor's mission is too serious to be held hostage to lack of means." End of quote. To my colleagues from around the world, this affects you too. Russian military aggression kills not only Ukrainians, but threatens thousands of foreigners who are staying in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is doing its best to facilitate their passage at the state border, even as the border has become overwhelmed with the massive influx of people fleeing Russia's armed aggression. Temporary volunteer assistance points have been set up at the border to provide foreign students with food and cater for other humanitarian needs. Please do not be misled by Russian disinformation. There is no discrimination based on race or nationality, and if there are cases, they should be investigated. Journalists working in the free press also are under fire during live reports from the scenes of action and hot spots. A journalist and a photographer working for the Danish newspaper Extra Bladet were injured when their car was targeted in Akhtirka district of Sumy region. Ukrainian children are crossing the EU-Ukraine border without their parents and without powers of attorney from their parents. In this regard, we request decision-makers in the EU countries to provide clarifications and instructions to EU institutions in order to secure free movement of and assistance to such underage persons and their guardians. According to the Ministry of Education of Ukraine, more than 350,000 school children have no access to education. Schools are closed due to severe insecurity in civil areas across the country. The numbers of refugees are being assessed. The numbers could be hundreds of thousands of people who have been forced to flee across international borders into neighboring European countries, mostly Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. It can take several days of waiting to cross the border, and we are grateful that more checkpoints on the border with Poland have been opened, including 2 additional pedestrian crossings for all who want to get from Ukraine to the neighboring safe country. Kyiv local authorities have set up a coordinating humanitarian headquarters to provide food and basic necessities to those in need. An electronic platform will be launched tomorrow. On this platform, businesses will be able to provide information about their available resources, and Kyiv residents will be able to announce their needs. All of this information will be systematized for effective communication and distribution of essential goods. Olga Stefanishina, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, who has been appointed as a government coordinator for humanitarian assistance, working 24/7. There are many urgent things to do, like to agree on humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians from the most endangered territories. However, I need to warn you not to be misled by Russian assurances of security. Russian words often, if not always, do not match their deeds. For instance, just recently we heard Russian politicians and diplomats, even here in this chamber, who said that there would be no invasion, no attacks on Ukraine. Hence, these corridors can be easy targets to the Russian army. To help people at the border, crossing points in western regions of Ukraine who are waiting for crossing for at least 1 to 2 days. To provide assistance to IDPs in western regions of Ukraine, including housing, schools, jobs. To provide humanitarian aid to civilians who remain home and now are cut off from markets, including in the occupied territories. Distinguished members of the Security Council, this is not only a security crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis, as I said before. The Russian war against Ukraine has brought the entire region to the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Let me therefore repeat our call to the international organizations to provide all possible humanitarian assistance and to register all cases in which international law and international humanitarian law are violated. You have all heard the lies from the Russian side, lies in Moscow, lies in the General Assembly, and lies in the Security Council. Distinguished members of the Security Council and friends around the world, do not listen to Russian lies. Listen to Ukraine's cries. Listen to the cries of men, women, and children who have lived in peace, who deserve to remain in peace, who will forever support your own nation's efforts for peace across Europe and around the world. Russia has tried and failed to defend its lies, but the people of Ukraine, with the help of the world, will never fail to defend our land. Do not listen to Russia's lies. Listen to Ukrainian cries. We need your help. The Russian ambassador laments that a dozen of Russian spies won't be able anymore to enjoy all the benefits of American life while doing things incompatible with their status used as a cover-up. The Russian ambassador should instead work hard to report to his superiors that only his cronies, a bunch of cronies, buy his narrative here in the United Nations. I want to conclude with saying that I'm looking forward to midnight, even though the midnight is the most dangerous time right now because that's when most of the attacks take place. But I'm looking forward to midnight, when this abomination, occupation of the seat of the President of the Council, will be over. I thank you.
А сейчас я хотел предоставить слово Мартину Гриффитсу и Филиппу Гранди просить их ответить на вопрос, который мы задали в ходе нашего выступления, как размещение тяжелых вооружений в жилых кварталах украинских городов соотносится с международным гуманитарным правом.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me respond to that, if I may, or try to. I can say that we have no confirmation of such reports of radicals placing such weaponry in residential areas. The fact is that accountability at this stage for breaches of international humanitarian law, which we must see in time, is naturally at this level of the conflict and this level of the violence, at this level of the uncertainty, very difficult to establish. We are truly in a period of a fog of war, a fog which obscures the futures of so many people of Ukraine. I made a number of points, I would add, in my remarks, in my briefing, about our fears of the impact on civilian objects, civilian infrastructure, as a result of urban warfare. I mentioned, for example, Mr. President, our reminder that large-scale urban warfare also requires the need to avoid the wide-area explosive weapons. We are very, very concerned at what we're seeing now in the streets of some of the key large modern cities of Ukraine, the way in which people are voting with their feet, the way in which basic services are being interrupted, and the way in which civilian infrastructure is being damaged. And we will, in time, I am quite sure, discover who did what and who broke which requirements of international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Хотел узнать, Филиппо Гранди, вы хотите сказать несколько слов?
Philippo Grandi, do you want to take the floor?
No, thank you, Mr. President. I fully support what the Undersecretary General just said. Thank you.
Список ораторов исчерпан. Прежде чем я закрою заседание, я хочу сказать, что, слушая комментарии наших сегодняшних докладчиков, я был удивлен, потому что одни доклады и видеоролики, и сообщения о том, что происходит на Украине, принимаются за данность, а другие, которые очевидны и которые выложены в интернете, достоверность которых не подлежит сомнению, считаются не то что недостоверными, они считаются, что они не прошли подтверждения и проверки. Но мы пришлем вам видеоролики с этими записями. Будем рассчитывать, что руководство ООН даст комментарии по поводу того, чем считать подобные действия украинских радикалов. Как я сказал, список ораторов исчерпан, поскольку это последнее запланированное заседание Совета в феврале, прежде чем объявить его закрытым от имени делегации Российской Федерации, я хотел бы выразить искреннюю признательность
of the Council for the month of February, I would like to express a sincere appreciation of the delegation of the Russian Federation to the members of the Council and the Secretariat for all the support that they've given to us. It was a busy month. We managed to get to consensus on several important issues within our purview, although, as you know, not on everyone. I would like to once again thank all the representatives of the Secretariat, including the conference services, interpreters and translators, verbatim reporters, and security staff. Our presidency is coming to an end, and I know I speak on behalf of the Council in wishing the delegation of the United Arab Emirates good luck in the month of March. The meeting is adjourned.
hope indeed at the end of the tunnel, and we hope that these discussions